Hello, everybody, and welcome to Guildmaster Gaming. This time around, I am with J.C. Chambers III, the author of BENREGESH, and we're going to be talking about his debut novel that came out, which is an interesting crossover between genres. But like I've been telling people all along, if you like what you're seeing here in these interviews, please like, share, subscribe to the channel so we can be doing more of these sort of things. So, J.C., welcome, and tell us,
Howdy.
what is the basics of BENREGESH?
So, uh, BENREGESH is what happens when you give yourself too much creative freedom. It is a high flying action fantasy. Um, One way I describe it to people is it's kind of like superheroes in like early 20th century, but in a really weird and honestly like unique world. I pull from a lot of different world building sources and just really mash all the cool things I can together, and it builds a story that has little bits of noir, little bits of Indiana Jones, but ultimately at its core heart, it's about a small group of characters who are trying to take down a bad guy, but in so doing, like they are also trying to protect each other and save each other and just survive this what essentially becomes a hellish mission that they're on.
Okay, so I'm going to ask some inspirations. You kind of gave us the inspiration there of what the story came from, some of it, some of the influences. But let's start with the title.
Okay. Yeah.
What?
So no, yeah. I love sharing this. Uh, One of so I pulled from a few different things when I was building the world for Benregesh. Some of it was like early 20th century Chicago. Some of it was a little bit of late 19th century France. Some of it was Bangkok. The main setting, Meteor City, is heavily based on my time living in Bangkok. Um, but I also pulled heavily from Hebrew inspirations in building the world, and I don't think quite it's not quite as obvious to say the Bangkok inspirations or the early 20th century inspirations, but a lot of the names are of Hebrew origin. In this case, Benregesh is the Hebrew equivalent of the Aramaic word Boanerges. And this is not a Bible story, but I just thought it was really cool. In the New Testament, you have the apostles James and John, who were called the sons of thunder, and that's what Boanerges means in Aramaic, more or less. It's sons of thunder. Benregesh is the Hebrew equivalent because people kept saying Boanerges wrong, and the word they were saying instead wasn't necessarily appropriate. um, Benregesh doesn't really translate to Sons of Thunder, and more translates to Sons of Passion. But that's how I render it still in the story, Sons of Thunder. I think I mentioned it 2 or 3 times throughout the narrative. And so, yeah, that's where the name Benregesh comes from. In hindsight, could I have come up with a better title? Maybe, but I do like the title.
It's got a certain amount of catch to it because it's like, where did that come from? What is that word?
Mhm.
And for most people, I don't think they're going to catch exactly where that came from originally. So there's that part. So now you've talked about some of your travels, the influence there. Now, one of the things that we've talked about before and you've mentioned is your anime and art also had a lot of influence. How
Mhm.
did how did the anime influence your story?
Um, so forgive the dogs, but uh, I mean, I grew up reading books, and I also grew up watching anime, and I grew up reading manga and all that stuff. And so all of that is a cultural influence for me. And something that's always been a part of my writing is a desire to bring the things that I really like about anime into my stories. And when I say anime, I typically mean shonen anime, because it has a very specific set of tropes and patterns that you'll see. You have the training arc, you have characters where their external battle that they're doing typically matches some kind of type of philosophical conflict. You have really colorful characters, and I think most importantly, you have really heroic characters. Even to this day, shonen has a very heroic element, and that's something I really wanted in my fantasy. Now, how that manifests is one, I'd like to say, are pretty climactic action battles. Like they get pretty crazy out there, and I ground it in the magic, where I try to make it so that everything that happens is something that the reader can say, "Oh, yeah, I can understand why this is happening, but it's still awesome." And to that point, for those who are watching this from home, uh, you know, I actually adapted some of my action scenes into manga and inserted it into the book. Like uh, that's how heavily my inspirations run. And I was actually pleasantly surprised by how easy it was to adapt from prose to comic. I wrote the comic script, and so I didn't just give prose to a comic artist. I wrote the comic script. I gave him a little bit of a world bible, and I did give him the original prose as the side if you really wanted to look at it. But he was working off a comic script, and it was a lot of fun. And I wear a lot of my inspirations on my sleeve. I have multiple references to Full Metal Alchemist throughout the book. Uh, uh, I mean, the conclusion of the story is very shonen-esque, with how the conflict is resolved. It's something that shonen fans would be very familiar with. So um, I wanted to take the best out of these stories that I grew up on and translate it over. Not everything translates. A lot of visual gags simply don't translate. I can't write characters, falling over when they think something is dumb, or having a sweat drop on their head when they're nervous. But like, because that's a very visual gag, and it's something that's easy to like pass off and understand in a visual medium. It's not something that translates very well in the written medium. So making choices like that was part of how I built the story.
Okay. Now the character looks themselves have some really unique looks, like even the character on the cover of your book. So, and the description of so many of the others, how did you come up with the design of your characters? Is that from your anime influences? Because even those and some of the monstrous designs and that just don't seem to fit some of these other references.
So a lot of that comes more from almost being pretentious. No. Uh, so when I was first formulating the idea for this story, this was some 10 years ago. At this point, I've written other stories since, but I eventually got this out. Um, uh, I was I was personally bored by elves and dwarves, and to a certain extent dragons. I still love dragons. I love elves. I love dwarves, but I didn't want to be another Tolkien knockoff, right? Um, and so a lot of where my characters and creatures came from was a combination of like, what are some cool concepts I can explore as far as physiology goes. Some of my favorite classes I've ever taken are biology classes because they give me really cool ideas for things I can do with creatures. Um, and then it was also just I'm not a horror author, but I do use a lot of horror elements to design my scarier creatures. I try to take stuff that is somewhat more familiar and then twist it so that it's creepy, right? And then I just have fun. I try to think of all the cool things I can think of and mash them together and come up with neat stuff.
Okay. So some of the things in there, and this keeps coming back to my thoughts as I was reading through it. You have this one sequence of events where they're in a fight competition, and you have some pretty deep descriptions of how they're kind of going through that. So it just begs the question, are you experienced being in the ring or working with someone in the ring?
No. uh, I've done a little bit of taekwondo, not much, and I've certainly never been in a fight. Um, My general strategy for resolving conflict is to run away if I can. Uh, but um, I'm fascinated by that world. Uh, One of the main reasons I included that scene is shonen battle tournaments are a major element of shonen, and I wanted a battle tournament, and it took on the form of a almost MMA style boxing
Mhm.
tournament. But um, I'm fascinated by that world. I'm fascinated by martial arts, by boxing. Like to me, boxing is a very beautiful sport. Is a very beautiful art, um, uh, and the different practical reasons it came about the way that it did. So one example is I distinguish between the more what we think of you put your both your hands up boxing, right, versus the having your hand, I can't show it on the camera, but you have one hand down guarding your liver and one hand up. And I love reading up on the history behind that. And the reason they used to do that is because before you had gloves, right, you couldn't punch very hard. You would break your hand on people's heads if you did that. And so uh, one of the most dangerous shots you could get was a liver shot. And that was a body shot. So you would keep one arm down to protect your body, one arm up. And if someone got you in the head, usually it wasn't as heavy of a blow as you'll see in modern boxing because they didn't have hand protection. It's actually safer to do bare knuckle boxing than boxing with gloves because gloves are actually weapons.
Okay. So you got a lot going on there. And we got this really unique world setting, world description in there. And this is a very much a contained story within itself. But do you have other stories within this world?
So yes. Um, so the first thing is that BenRegesh, I'm currently in the process of splitting the large volume into three smaller novels, and those are actually going to be up in like the next day or two. Is my plan, because I want to be able to release more rapidly and not have to take 2 years between each release because that will kill me. Um, but uh, but the reason I'm doing that is because there are going to be sequels. Like Benregesh is part one. Um, you can think of it as being the first saga of the series. So you have like in Dragon Ball Z, you have the Saiyan saga, you have the Namek saga, Cell saga. This is the Benregesh saga. And the next saga that follows will be a series of novels as well that I'll eventually combine into a single volume and release. And hopefully by that point, I'll be able to justify putting comic art in again because that was really fun. But so that's the main story, right? There's like a million side stories I want to tell that that don't fit into that main narrative. I alluded to a few of them. So Briel's backstory, I actually wrote about 8,000 words of backstory for that, and I cut it from the final book because it just didn't work with the pacing of the story. Trina, I allude to her having a backstory with her granny and coming down from the city of Ariel, and I'd love to explore that backstory for her someday. Um, uh, there's the Siege of Lorth that I talk about frequently. We don't even see Lorth in the book. I think we'll see it in the next saga, but uh, like there's stuff with that. Um, right now, a lot of who the Great King it was and like the story around him is kind of spoilery territory. But eventually, when we get past that point, I would love to explore his story and his backstory. So um, I have just oodles of things that I could possibly explore in the future. So yes,
So I just want to make sure to clarify so people know. So you're taking the current novel and breaking it into three?
yeah.
Okay.
Um, and the reason for that is I have a couple of reasons for that. Part of it has to do with how I released it in the first place. I originally wrote it as a series of novellas. I was about five novellas in. I had released the second novella, and I lost my job the next day. I was self-publishing, and I didn't have the money to publish the next volume, the next novella, and so I was forced to wait. And as I'm waiting, I'm like, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to do one big volume, and I'm going to make it as awesome as I freaking can. And that's what I did. And I'm very proud of it, and I love it to death. But it it is not necessarily the most sustainable model, especially for the indie market right now. And so uh, it splits very nicely into three novels. It has uh, because even though I rewrote significant portions of the individual novellas to be more cohesive, there's still decent breaks between different parts of the book. And what that'll do is it'll allow me to, going forward, publish smaller novels. And my plan is basically, in the same way that BENREGESH ends on a very satisfying note, I plan to, when I come back to the Cocoon Chronicles, which is the series this is, I plan to rapidly publish shorter novels one after the other. And then when I get to a good conclusion stopping point, then I'll take a break and work on something else for a little while. But I don't ever want to leave someone on a cliffhanger.
Okay. So when you're saying, taking breaks from it, are you currently taking a break from this series and writing something else? Are
Yes,
you
I
moving?
am.
So what are you working on now?
Um, I think I actually can send you what I'm working on right now because I got the cover this morning. Uh, so it's nearly ready for so I'm working toward it. My goal is to publish it in about 2 or 3 months. It's a
Okay.
space opera, and I'm not seeing a way to send it to you, so oh
So
well.
I was going to say,
Uh,
if you want, I just made changes so you can share screen. So if you want to flash it up on the screen,
yeah,
you
yeah,
can do
absolutely.
that.
Let me pull up downloads, and here we go. So, all right, and then go back to here, share screen, and want to do a window. Okay, so outside of a handful of friends and family, you are the first person to see this cover. So,
Star Caliber
yep,
Crystal Heist series.
yeah.
All
So
right.
it's a space opera. It's Arthurian myth in space. Uh, it's this about a young-ish thief, space pirate who takes part in a heist that goes wrong, very wrong, and ends with a lot of people dead. But out of the ashes of that heist gone wrong begins a quest for the legendary sword, Star Caliber. So,
All right.
yeah.
So we have that to look forward to.
Yeah, that should be out in a couple months, give or take, depending on how long editing takes. And my plan is to release at least 2 books this year. And I've already got a decent chunk of content ready for the second book as well. So moving along quickly.
All right. So to keep yourself motivated, not so much in writing, but in the mental state, I know that's always a thing, always looking, you got the inspiration, but there's times when it's just like, what are you doing? And what are some of the things you do to keep that mental energy going for yourself? What are some of your hobbies and things that you like to just relax with?
I'm allowed to have hobbies. So I still have a day job. So that takes up a lot of my mental energy each day. So often what I'll do when I get off work is I'll either go for a walk if the weather is nice. I don't do cold, so if it's winter, I don't go for a walk. But I'll play video games or just something that lets my brain decompress for a bit. And then once I've had a bit of time to rest, maybe listen to a podcast, I'll hop on. Sometimes it'll be my computer. Sometimes I'll do it on my phone. I don't have it with me, but I have a little keyboard that I'll just put my phone into and pull up Google Docs, and I'll just type away at that, and that's how I get words down. And I can be reasonably prolific. It depends on how crazy the day job is, but I can do 50,000 words in a month pretty easily. Never done it during November, but November hates me. November is the worst month out of the year, I swear.
Okay. So
But
kind of going back in your life then, what is your inspiration for wanting to be a writer and to create books?
so when I was a kid, when I was 12 years old. We were living on a military base in Japan, and um, our bookstore was about the size of the room I'm sitting in right now. Um, and the fantasy section could fit on my desk basically, and it was basically all Robert Jordan and like Terry Goodkind, and great authors in their own rights, but they weren't what I wanted to read. Um, and it was really hard for me to find what I wanted to read. And in school, as an adult, I appreciate a bit more some of the books they had us read, but I swear sometimes it felt like they were trying to make reading as miserable as humanly possible so that no one would enjoy it. Um, and so I was like, well, if I can't find the books that I want to read, I will write the books I want to read. And to this day, I'm writing the same kinds of books, just hopefully better. Uh,
Okay.
and yeah,
So yeah, so you're not really into that long. I seen how to say this in a polite way. Not into that long-winded style of Robert Jordan.
I can appreciate George. Um, I compare it to being like a very fine cheese, right? It's very dense, and it's I actually think I stole this from a friend in my writing group, but it's very dense and very good, but I can only eat so much of it at a time. So I read through The Eye of the World. I really enjoyed it. I tried to start the second book, and I think I got a chapter in. And I'm like, no, I got to go read something else. Uh, and I have been able to find a lot of the books that I was looking for as a teenager in varying degrees. So I do enjoy traditional fantasy. I've read Lord of the Rings. Um, I've read, and I've read a lot of more contemporary authors. But I found a lot of the stuff I really enjoy is in the indie sphere. There's a lot of people out there who are writing the kind of stuff that I was looking for as a teenager, and it's been a lot of fun to encounter. Game lit RPG, progression fantasy. These are subgenres that have come about in like the past 5, maybe 10 years at most, and uh, the teenager in me is just jumping for joy.
Yeah, that is something that's really kind of picking up. I think the movie Jumanji really kind of helped some of that kind of give the idea of what it's all about.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Um, One of my favorite books as a teenager. This was one of the few that my poor mother was able to find for me. She was cursed with a son who really liked a particular thing, and there wasn't a much of it around. But Connor Caustic's Epic. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No.
Uh, it was a lit RPG before lit RPG was a genre,
Okay.
and it was just a metric ton of fun. It's about a it's about this world where they've completely gotten rid of violence. There's no war, no fighting. Violence in any form is illegal. And the way they resolve conflicts is they hop into a VR MMO and they duke it out in there. But what's happened is because of this, this almost governmentization of this video game, most people have forgotten what it like the purpose of the original game, which was to have fun, to go explore things. And the main character accidentally figures this out and goes on this really cool adventure throughout this game world. And in so doing, he accidentally sets off a series of events that causes like a cataclysmic like event for this world government. And it's just a lot of fun. I had a blast reading it as a teenager.
Okay. I'm going to brag up a point here. I was asked to take over the gaming track at the LTUE Writing Symposium next year. And
Mhm.
one of the things I've already proposed is I want to bring in some, because they want, kind of tie in writing and gaming and how it works. And one thing I point out to them is they've never had a true full-on like lit RPG panel.
Did you talk with Jay Barneson about this?
I've already mentioned that to get him involved because I've reviewed his book, the
Mhm,
first one of his series.
mhm.
And so just kind of, I can see that kind of sparked your interest already there, that it's like, yeah, so I understand what you're saying, and I'm kind of trying to progress some of that and bring more of it to the forefront.
Yeah,
So,
I'm familiar with Jay's work,
uh-huh.
and I've read. I can't remember the title. I'm terrible, but I've read his first book, and I really enjoyed it. And there's another Jay in our community, Jay Boyce, who
Okay.
also writes lit RPG, um, and she's wonderful. I hers was the first lit RPG I read that I really enjoyed. I found with a lot of lit RPG, there is a within the audience, there is a preference for quantity over quality often, and that's their prerogative. But it's not necessarily what I enjoy in stories. Um,
Mhm.
but what that's meant is there's been a lot of less than stellar examples of storytelling elevated in the lit RPG genre, and they don't work for me. And hers was the first true lit RPG where I read it. I'm like, I really like this. It's slice of life. It's very cozy. It's wish fulfilling by design, but I loved it. So
So
it's
when
as
can we expect a lit RPG from you then?
that's a tricky question. um, uh, I'm a software engineer by trade. I enjoy programming. I've done game development on the side as a hobby, and I've considered um, making lit RPG, and I even dabbled in writing one a few years ago. And what I discovered was that I don't necessarily enjoy following beaten tropes very much, and lit RPG is a very trope heavy genre at the moment. And so it has been a tricky balance for me, finding something that like I can really like just sink my teeth into and really enjoy, but also makes me feel like I'm making something uh, that you haven't read a million times before, which I know sounds really pretentious. I'm not, I am not a good enough wordsmith to be saying that, but a lot of BENREGESH was me trying to make something that people haven't read very much before. And in some ways, it still is things people have read before. I think you said so in your review that the characters fill certain expected roles, but I used that because there's so much other craziness going on. Like the world, to my knowledge, I've never read another world quite like it.
Oh no.
Um, yeah, and you mentioned weird fiction without the hopelessness, and I'm like, yeah, that's fair. But that's why I would never classify it as weird fictions because it doesn't have that hopelessness. I wanted that really cool world without the like pessimistic themes. And so, but so as far as writing lit RPG goes, I've toyed with it a lot. I've toyed with a lot of game lit. I've toyed with a lot of really hard progression fantasy. And so far, nothing has really stuck with me. I would say Benregesh is a progression fantasy light. So if you like took it to a normal progression fantasy fan, they'd be like, I'm not sure this counts as progression fantasy. It doesn't have enough emphasis on how he powers up, but I still consider it progression fantasy. And uh, and in that way, as far as making a lit RPG goes, I definitely have plenty of ideas, plenty of things in mind, but nothing that has like uh, moved me in the way Star Caliber has. Before I started writing Star Caliber, I had tried writing two different stories. After finishing BENREGESH, I needed a break. I was burnt out beyond all belief. And so I got novel length twice, two different projects, and threw them away because they weren't working for me. And it's not that I was bored with the story and like struggling to make it through. I have developed a discipline at this point where I can push through the hard parts of the story. The story itself wasn't taking off. And I think a lot of writers, even successful ones, can relate to that, where they think this is the next story that they really want to work on. They get really far into it, and like something about this isn't clicking, and I don't know how to fix it. So I'm going to shelve it for now and work on something else. But when I started Star Caliber, um, it was just like a switch flipped, just like the words just exploded. And it's not progression fantasy. It has a lot of similar inspirations to, you know, BENREGESH. Uh, and like you could argue that it will have progression fantasy elements. It will have characters learning, gaining magic powers, and getting stronger. But I'm not thinking of it as a progression fantasy. I'm thinking of it as a space opera.
Okay. So we got that going. So we've kind of been talking now for about a half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to ask something. If you had, a new author, and I'm willing to bet you've had this happen. You get someone that comes up and says, "Hey, I want to be an author. I want to write."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What advice do you give them?
Um, I just tell them to write. Well, so usually I don't jump straight into advice. Usually I ask them what they want to write about. Because if there's one thing I know, it's that writers really like talking about their stories. Um, uh, and almost always they get really excited. Sometimes they're a little embarrassed, like, oh, I don't know if this is a good idea or not. But like ultimately, the reason they want to write is because they think it's cool. Um, and and so I think the first thing is I just want to make sure that they know that someone else is excited about their story. Um, the next thing is, yeah, you just got to write. If they've already written stuff, that's awesome. I generally don't read first chapters from people, even from friends, because I can. This is going to sound condescending, but I can usually predict what their story needs to be worked on without reading it, because they were the same things I needed to work on when I first got started. They're the same things everybody needs to work on. That you need to figure out when it's time to show versus tell. You need to figure out your pacing, your POV, like how how long do you want to spend on this particular thing, how do you cut extraneous details. These are all things that every author has to go through, I found. And so what I but what I'll do is I'll say, yeah, keep writing, absolutely. um, uh, in the off chance that I do read their stuff, I'll usually get through like a page or two, mark up a few things that I'm usually expecting. Passive voice is a big one, and be like, hey, like here's some things you can work on, but keep going. Like it's worth it. I'll often tell them that it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. I started writing when I was 12 years old, and I turned 30 recently. Um, so I've been doing this for 18 years now, and, uh, and yeah, just and I'll tell them to just take advantage of as many resources as they can. I love recommending Fiction Writers Workshop by Josip Novakovic. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but he probably has my favorite um, fiction instruction book that I've ever read. It's just fantastic. I'll recommend, things like Brandon Sanderson's lectures. I'll recommend um, Fantasy Writing Formula by Deborah Chester. The same things that helped me get further, even if I can't necessarily give them the feedback that they would hopefully want. I can at least tell them the exactly. Yeah, Fantasy Fiction Formula, great book. I try to tell them the same resources that worked for me or that I've heard worked for other people. Writing groups, going to play things like LTUE, making friends with people who have a similar goal, which is to tell really freaking cool stories and hopefully get paid for it.
So I think you're in some good company because, that book was also recommended to me by Jim Butcher.
Oh, Deborah. Yeah. He wrote the foreword for it.
Yeah, he was in her coursework. She was his advisor at going after his MFA, and kind of said, this is the kind of the story that goes along with it. He was going to prove her wrong because he was, he had his degree in literature and was going to prove this award-winning, multiple talented author that she was wrong. And he did everything she said. And during that program, that's when he did the complete story arc for over 20 books of Dresden.
It's a good book. I can't say I follow it precisely, but that's because I view it the same way I view everything else. I view it as a tool that I can
Yeah,
use to make myself better.
that's
I'm always maybe that's the thing I would tell them is be hungry. Never think that you know it all. Always be learning, because you will die before you figure everything out when it comes not just writing but life, but especially writing. Uh, so just always be learning. If you're ever feeling like, okay, I think I'm doing pretty good, I don't have to learn too much more, then you're just going to write shit books.
yeah. And I
Uh,
understand.
I
You're
just
fine.
swore.
You're fine. We're not child friendly.
Okay. I was on another podcast the other day, and I accidentally let it slip, and they put up a banner saying "No longer safe for work." It's like, you bastards.
Yeah, I do a lot with other people, especially in the film industry. And yeah, the language goes pretty wild there because most of the film people I work with are horror directors. So
Mhm. I try to keep f bombs out of my books, but otherwise, I'm very uh, loose with my swearing. I swear a ton in my books.
yeah. Yeah, they weren't as bad as others I've read. Let me put it that way. They weren't as but it's always if it's appropriate, and that's the main thing.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I mean, it sounds like you got some great stuff. We got some where you're coming from with this, and we can look forward to seeing Star Caliber coming out in a couple of months, and also the re-release of Bangladesh. Bangladesh in Bangladesh. I'll get it right. In 3 volumes, so it's a little bit easier, more digestible, maybe for people.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you about it's more of a marathon than a sprint. One of the people I have done some work with as a writer, he is now finished up. He just finished up his edits and everything for his 24th novel. And he says he's in his 11th year of his 9-year program of being an overnight success.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, that and I mean, when BENREGESH came out, obviously you wanted to sell super well. It didn't sell super well because whatever reasons. And I thought about it, I'm like, okay, do I try to just really push this hard and keep going for it, or do I just release more books? Because to my knowledge, the best marketing you can do for existing books is to release more books. So that's when I was like, okay, let's get cracking. All right, Star Caliber, baby.
Yeah, Vonnegut's rule of becoming a successful author. Write something new.
Yep.
Okay, so we've heard all this, but now if people want to follow you and find out some more information about you, where can they find you online?
So the easiest place to find me is at my website. It's jcthethird.com. And so it's the third is spelled out. So jcthethird.com. That has links to all my social media. I am on uh, Facebook. I have a public profile people can follow, and I try to post there regularly. I'm also on Twix. I mean, Twitter, X, whatever it's called. I'm not super um, active there, but you can find me there. And I try to be active in a few different places. So, but wherever I am, if people want to reach out and say hi, feel free. I'm always happy to chat,
Okay,
especially about video games, anime, and more video games.
more on video games, not the ones you've tried writing, but the ones you play.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I grew up playing video games. I still play them. They are a good way for me to decompress.
So what's your lead game right now that you're playing?
I've been playing a lot of Dragon's Dogma too. Um, uh, it's I played the original Dragon's Dogma back when it first came out, and I really enjoyed it. Um, and Dragon's Dogma 2 feels like what Dragon's Dogma was trying to be but couldn't be because of either budgetary reasons or technological reasons. So like the world back then was really small and like there were a lot of limitations, but like this new game, it's gorgeous. It plays like butter, smooth as butter. The world is huge, like surprisingly large, because it's not just big; it's also like dense. Like it's almost labyrinthian in that way. It's almost reminds me of the Cocoon, um, but uh, and there's a really good variety of biomes. You go from traditional fantasy land to like a desert to like a type of like Greenland or Iceland style like island volcano area. And it's just a lot of fun, and I've had a lot of fun exploring it.
All right. So that's where you can find JC, as you can go online to his jcthethird.com, and you can get with him and chat about his book, chat about games or video games. Yeah. And we'll be looking forward to Star Chamber or Star, almost called it the wrong thing, Star Caliber coming out.
Star Chamber.
Yeah, that's why I was like, whoa, no, that's an old time movie. Uh, probably a little bit different feel from that. For those people that know, yeah, that's a very different film. So yeah, and I have already reviewed BENREGESH, and it's been published out on Guildmaster Gaming. I will put a link in the notes here so that if you want, after seeing this, you can go back through, and I'll add a link in the review back to this here once I get it all published out on YouTube. So again, if you like what you're seeing, please, like, share it out with other people that you think will be interested. Subscribe to the channel because it just helps us out. And thank you, JC, for joining with me. I hope
Thanks for having me on, Dan.
I hope we can chat again when we get the new book out.
I would love to. I'm really excited about this book. I think people are going to really enjoy it. I've had a lot of fun writing it.
All right. So just as we finish up, I'm going to let you take the last word. Anything else that you'd just like to say, cover, anything you'd like to say? It can even be swearing.
um, uh, so to everyone who's been watching, sorry about the dog barking in the background. It's still working on that with her. But aside from that, if you think anything I discussed here today has been interesting, I really do hope you check out BENREGESH and when it comes out, Star Caliber. Uh, BENREGESH is the passion project. I had so much fun putting this together. It is as much cool as I could stuff into 700 plus pages. And but you know, I'm always happy to just chat about nerdy stuff. I love video games. I love books. I love anime. So always happy to chat. So thanks for watching, and I hope you give my stuff a look.
Thanks again. And thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you all later.